This is the town of Fort Collins, Colorado, and right through the middle of town, a railroad runs straight through Fort Collins. This railroad is the BNSF's Front Range subdivision, going from Denver, Colorado to Cheyenne, Wyoming. While it isn't exactly busy, it still has some importance for BNSF, especially if one of their main routes from Denver to Wyoming were to be shut down or a derailment were to occur. But how are trains still running through Fort Collins today? And did they ever try to remove the street running? Yes, they did, ages ago. And yet, the street running has still remained today. Let's take a dive into the history of the street running in Fort Collins and see why the street running still remains. And trust me, the answer may be a bit surprising. But first, we need a little bit of backstory as to how this railroad line existed in the first place, and why they eventually attempted to remove it in the 80s. So, let's talk about that first, shall we? Railroading in Fort Collins would begin, as many would expect, in the late 1800s, specifically in 1877, where the Colorado Central, a Union Pacific subsidiary, built tracks to Fort Collins. These tracks were laid on Mason Street, which will be a source of contention in a bit, but after the tracks came, the trains came, and Fort Collins saw a business boom. Later on, another Union Pacific line, this time a subsidiary called the Greeley, Salt Lake and Pacific Railroad, built a line to Fort Collins from Greeley in 1881. However, in 1898, the Colorado and Southern took control of the two railroads and consolidated them into one. Later on, the CNS became a subsidiary of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, or the Burlington route. Yet, business in Fort Collins continued, and the CNS would also begin running a local train to Fort Collins, which still exists today. However, not to be too deterred, the Union Pacific would head back to Fort Collins a few years later, specifically in 1910 when they laid a branch line that went from Greeley to Fort Collins, and a little bit beyond. Nevertheless, over the years, the trains through Fort Collins contributed to the economy, and at Colorado State University, CSU, there was even a dedicated station to pick up and drop off students at CSU, where the original got burned in 1924 by those Buffalo bastards at CU Boulder. Nevertheless, over the years, the railroads continued to serve Fort Collins, and there was even a dog at the CNS station that was named Annie the Railroad Dog, who was adopted in 1934 and would greet passengers getting off at the station, and Annie the Railroad Dog became a bit of a mascot in the local Fort Collins area for the CNS. Sadly, in 1948, Annie passed away. She would be buried next to the tracks with a hand-poured cement gravestone saying, "From C&S men to Annie, our dog." And unfortunately, with Annie's passing, it seemed as if though the charm of the railroads in Fort Collins went with her. It's a story you heard 1,000 times, but when the 1950s and 60s rolled around, trains went downhill in America. A federally funded interstate system gave many people the alternative to drive places and ship goods by truck rather than train. The jet age also brought about a quicker way to go from city to city, eating away at more of the railroad's passenger revenue, let alone their profits. To add insult to injury, especially for passenger trains, the ICC implemented a 79-mile-per-hour passenger train's top speed unless a line had train protection systems after a crash in 1946. Very few railroads bothered to implement the tech. resulting in passenger trains unable to compete with airlines, let alone compete with cars and/or buses. In FoCo's case, the railroads started more of passing through Fort Collins rather than stopping at Fort Collins. The passenger depot closed in 1953, but passenger rail service would continue through the area until ceasing in 1967 when the Shoshone was canned. And for a bit, trains still rolled through Fort Collins, but they were all freight trains. This is where we get to the attempts to move the trains away from Fort Collins. Talks about moving the trains away from Fort Collins were floated in the 1960s, but they went nowhere, and the trains still rolled through. Eventually in 1970, the CB&Q, which owned the C&S, merged with the Great Northern and Northern Pacific to form Burlington Northern. Only in 1981 would the C&S officially become a part of the Burlington Northern. The 1980s is when the most recent attempt to move trains away from Fort Collins was initiated. According to former FoCo City Council member John Clark, in 1983, an ambulance was carrying a patient when the ambulance got behind a crossing on Prospect Road where a train was passing by. The patient would make it to Poudre Valley Hospital, but unfortunately, the patient sadly passed away while in hospital. But according to Clark, he was assured that the reason the patient died wasn't because of the train stopping the ambulance. Since Clark was on the city council at the time though, this is when he brought up removing the street running in 1984. Clark also stated that removing the tracks through the middle of FoCo would have brought ideas like light rail along Mason Street. Let's be real, they would have ended up converting that section into a trail. In 1986, negotiations began, and it was decided that BN trains would be routed through a former CB&Q line from Fort Collins to Greeley, where it had joined the Union Pacific line and continued to Denver. Several towns along the proposed routing, though, mainly Windsor and Greeley, didn't like this proposal and even set up an anti-rerouting committee to raise funds for legal action. This was when they instead chose to have the reroute go along Union Pacific tracks to Denver, which I sure hope you didn't already tear up part of the Dent branch between Brighton and Dent, or else you'd have to build a whole new southbound connector at LaSalle. In 1988, Burlington Northern said that a deal was finalized, and trains would be rerouted away from street running in FoCo to along the Union Pacific. At this point, the FoCo street running was screwed, or as people on Discord would say, the FoCo street running is cooked. Skull emoji, skull emoji, skull emoji, skull emoji, skull emoji. Oh my god, do you know how much I fucking hate the skull emoji? Jesus Christ. This would have been the end of the line, pun intended, for the tracks through the middle of Fort Collins. However, the tracks are still there, and still in service. What was the street running tracks' savior? What was their knight in shining armor? Well, the thing that saved the Fort Collins street running tracks' bacon was beer! What? Around the time that the deal was finalized, a brewer called Anheuser-Busch came to town. The brewery at Fort Collins would have needed a lot of additional traffic and trains from the Burlington Northern. And in 1989, 1 year after the deal was finalized, Burlington Northern went back on the rerouting deal and the whole thing fell through. And so, through beer, the Fort Collins street running was saved from being confined into the pages of history. And today, the street running has remained and left unchanged. Almost unchanged. Prior to 2012, the tracks were literally in the street, but afterwards the tracks and roads were separated a bit so that the cars wouldn't consistently turn in front of the train, with things potentially going very wrong from there. And that is the only major change that has happened to the line during the 21st century anyways. There is a lot more about railroads in Fort Collins, but that's something for another video. Today, trains still rumble through Fort Collins, although they're not that frequent. There has not been another effort to reroute the trains from the middle of Fort Collins, and given the plans for Front Range Passenger Rail to bring passenger trains back to Fort Collins, and eventually along the entire Front Range of Colorado, it doesn't look like there's going to be another effort to remove the tracks anytime soon. My source used for this video is this article by the Coloradoan. In fact, a lot of the words that I said in this video come from said article, although a bit of the info about Annie the Railroad Dog also comes from this article too. If you want to go checking them out, the links are in the description below. Thank you for watching, guys. Have a good day.